Today is Good Friday, and we are going to utilize the Gospel of Mark, and I'm also using Tim Keller's book, King's Cross, to help us think through that particular day. Jesus is on trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin, a ruling council of religious leaders. They hate Jesus. They want him to put him to death, but they're not finding any evidence against him because obviously he's an innocent man. There's nothing more dramatic than to be on trial for your life, and no more dramatic moment in a trial when the defendant is called to the stand as a witness. And perhaps never has there been a more dramatic and shocking testimony given on the witness stand than the one Jesus Christ gave during his trial. We pick up the story in Mark 14, verse 60. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest puts Jesus on the witness stand, as it were, and he asks, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" Now, at other times in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus avoided similar lines of inquiry about his identity, or he turned the question back on the questioner. This time, Jesus answers the central question of the Gospel of Mark head on, positively and fully. He says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." By saying "I am," Jesus claims to be the Messiah, the promised one. However, we should remember that in general the Jews did not expect the Christ, the Messiah, to be literally divine. And therefore Jesus goes on to amplify the meaning of the label Messiah by identifying himself as the Son of Man, and also by saying that he will sit at the right hand of God. In both of Jesus' biblical allusions here, the Son of Man comes from Daniel 7:13, and at his right hand comes from Psalm 110, verse 1. The Messiah is claiming to be divine, and he's saying he will come as a judge. Everybody in the room, all the ruling council of Sanhedrin, knows who the Son of Man is. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man comes from the throne of God to earth in the clouds of heaven to judge the world. And the clouds of heaven don't mean the same thing as our clouds here on earth, which are water vapor. It's really talking about the Shekinah glory of God, the very presence of God. And by replying this way, Jesus is saying, "I will come to earth in the very glory of God and judge the entire world." And it's an astounding statement, and it's a claim to be deity. Of all the things Jesus could have said, and there are many texts, themes, images, metaphors, passages in the Hebrew Scriptures that he could have used to tell who he was, he specifically says he's the judge. By choice of this text, Jesus is deliberately forcing us to see a paradox here. There has been an enormous reversal. He is the judge over the entire world, and yet here he is being judged by the world. He should be in the judgment seat. We should be in the dock and chains. Everything is turned upside down. And as soon as Jesus claims to be this judge, as soon as he claims to be deity, the response is explosive. Mark writes, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. The high priest rips his own garments apart, which is a sign of the greatest possible outrage, horror, and grief. And then the whole trial deteriorates. In fact, it's no longer a trial, it's a riot. The jurors, the judges begin to spit on him and beat him. And in the middle of the trial, they go absolutely berserk. He is instantly convicted of blasphemy and he is condemned as being worthy of death. But the Sanhedrin did not have power to pass a death sentence, and I think they also probably wanted to pass some of the blame off on Rome instead of themselves, and so for capital cases they would go to the Roman procurator. And so as soon as they're able to, the Sanhedrin hands Jesus over to Pilate, the governor appointed by Rome, so that they can get him to put Jesus to death. Mark continues in chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, and so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Jesus is on trial again, this time before Pilate. The religious leaders offer a battery of charges. Jesus doesn't answer them. To the marvel of Pilate, he doesn't defend himself. We know from the other gospel writers that Pilate has no desire to try this case at all. He vacillates, he stalls in an attempt to get out of it, but he has another card to play. He may be able to escape the responsibility of a decision about this man through a time-honored custom of releasing a prisoner amid the time of general rejoicing over in the Passover season. And so Mark writes, "It was now the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. 'Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?' asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. Pilate is still trying to find a way out. He knows the religious leaders are only accusing Jesus out of envy. They don't have a case. Barabbas is a violent man who's been convicted of murder. Will Pilate knowingly free a guilty man and condemn an innocent one?" Mark continues, "But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. 'What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?' Pilate asked them. 'Crucify him,' they shouted. 'Why? What crime has he committed?' asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, 'Crucify him.' And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. Pilate is extremely reluctant to execute Jesus, but despite pronouncing that Jesus is not guilty of any capital offense, he hands him over to be crucified. Crucifixion is designed to be the most humiliating and gruesome method of execution. The Romans reserved it for their worst offenders. It was protracted, bloody, public spectacle of extreme pain that usually ended in a horrible death by shock or asphyxiation. But it is noteworthy that Mark gives few of the gory details. He aims the spotlight away from the physical horrors of Jesus' ordeal in order to focus on the deeper meaning behind the events. He simply records in Mark 15:20-24, "Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, dividing up his clothes. They cast lots to see what each would get." Although Mark makes no explicit reference to the fulfillment of prophecy, his choice of wording here shows that he's thinking of Psalm 22, which was written hundreds of years before Jesus came and yet perfectly describes his suffering on the cross. It says in Psalm 22, "All who seek me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted away within me. Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now imagine what the followers of Jesus felt as they watched this scene around the cross, as they watched the man that they had followed for years being crucified. Here was a man who had calmed storms, banished sickness, cheated death by the miraculous power of his word. Here is a man who less than a week before had been given a king's welcome to Jerusalem. Here was the Christ. How could this be happening? Mark goes on in chapter 15, verse 25, it was the third hour when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. In their depictions of Jesus' death, Mark and the 3 other gospel writers show a consistent concern for what visual artists call values. That is, an interplay between darkness and light. All 4 gospel writers take pains to show us that all the critical events of Jesus' death happened in the dark. The betrayal, the trial before the Sanhedrin. But now at the actual moment of Jesus' death, though it is daytime, an inexplicable darkness descends. It says at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. The 6th hour was noon. The 9th hour was 3 p.m. So from 12 to 3 in the afternoon, as Jesus was dying, there was total darkness. Now, many people have proposed a natural cause for this event, an eclipse, for instance. But a solar eclipse does not create absolute darkness for more than a few minutes. Further, a solar eclipse can't happen during the time of a full moon, and Passover was always celebrated at a full moon. Other people have suggested the cause was a desert windstorm of the type that can kick up enough dust to obscure the sun for days at a time. But Passover falls during the wet season, so this darkness couldn't have come from a wind or dust storm. This was a supernatural darkness, and in the Bible, darkness during the day is recognized as a sign of God's displeasure and judgment. The supreme example of that is the plague of darkness that came upon Egypt during Passover in Exodus 10. And so when this darkness fell, we know that God is acting in judgment. But who was God judging? Mark continues in verse 33, at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When Jesus started to cry out, he didn't say, my friends, or my hands. He said, my God. On the cross, Jesus was forsaken by God. He said, my God. That's the language of intimacy. If you put the word "my" in front of your wife's name or your son's name, that's a sign of affection. And biblically, my God is a covenantal address. It's the way that God said someone should address him if he or she had a personal relationship with him. You shall be my people, and I shall be your God. My God, why have you forsaken me? If after a service some member of our church comes to me and says, I never want to see you or talk to you again, I will feel pretty bad about that. But today, if my wife comes up to me and says, I never want to see you or talk to you again, that's a whole lot worse. The longer the love, the deeper the love, the greater the torment of its loss. But this forsakenness, this loss, was between the Father and the Son, who had loved each other from all eternity. This love was infinitely long, absolutely perfect, and Jesus was losing it. Jesus was being cut out of the eternal dance of the Trinity. Jesus, the maker of the world, was being unmade. Why? Jesus was experiencing our judgment day. My God, why have you forsaken me? It wasn't a rhetorical question, and the answer is for you and for me and for us. Jesus was forsaken by God so that we would never have to be. The judgment that should have fallen on us fell instead on Jesus. These days, most of us don't know what real physical darkness is. Even when we're out in the country at night, there are usually towns nearby. There's plenty of electric lights around, or the headlights of cars. And so if you're in utter darkness, that's different. If you're in utter darkness, you can't see in front of your face, your hand, if you were to look at it. To stay in utter darkness for an extended period of time can be radically disorienting. In 1914, British explorer Ernest Shackleton and his crew took a ship to Antarctica. And their plan was to land, walk across Antarctica, cross over the South Pole, and continue all the way across. The plan had to be abandoned, though, because their ship, the Endurance, got caught in polar ice and was crushed. Over the following months, Shackleton's crew fought just to survive and to get home. One of Shackleton's biographers said that of all the difficulties they faced, including starvation and frigid temperatures, the worst thing was the darkness. Near the South Pole, the sun goes down in mid-May and it doesn't come up again until late July. There's no daytime, no sunlight for more than 2 whole months. In all the world, the biographers of polar explorers say there's no desolation more complete than the polar night. Only those who have experienced it can fully appreciate what it means to be without the sun, day after day, week after week. Few, unaccustomed to it, can fight off its effects altogether, and has driven many men mad. In such deep darkness, you can't look forward, so you don't know where you're going. You have no direction. You can't even see yourself. And you don't know what you even look like. It's like you have no identity. You can't tell whether there is anyone around you either, friend or foe, through the use of your eyes. You're isolated. Physical darkness brings disorientation. But according to the Bible, so does spiritual darkness. Spiritual darkness comes when we turn away from God as our true light and make something else the center of our life. The Bible sometimes compares God to the sun. The sun is a source of visual truth because by it we see everything else. And the sun is a source of biological life because without it nothing could live. And God, the Bible says, is the source of all truth and all life. If you orbit your life around God, then your life will have truth and vitality. You are in the light in that case. But if you turn away from God and you orbit your life around anything else, your career, relationship, your family, and make those things the source of your warmth and your hope, the result will be spiritual darkness. You are turning away from the truth, away from the life, and toward darkness. When you're in spiritual darkness, although you may feel like your life is headed in the right direction at times, you are actually profoundly disoriented. If anything but God is more important to you, then you have a problem with direction. It's impossible to discern where you're going, let alone where you ought to be going. Money, career, love, for a period of time might feel like you have something to live for in those things, But if you actually get the thing that you're seeking, you suddenly realize it's not big enough for your soul. It doesn't produce its own light. Also, if you center on anything but God, you suffer a loss of identity. Your identity will be fragile and insecure because it's based on things you center your life on. It's based on human approval. It's based on how well you perform. You don't really know who you truly are. In the darkness, you can't see yourself. Moreover, in spiritual darkness, you are isolated. You are wrapped up in the things that you're living for, and so you're always scared or angry or proud or driven or full of self-pity. As a result, you become isolated from other people. Spiritual darkness, turning away from God, the true light, and making anything more important than Him, leads invariably from disorientation to disintegration. And apart from the intervention of God, we're all in spiritual darkness. We're all orbiting around something else instead of God. And we're all incapable of changing our orbit because we inevitably, ultimately seek to glorify ourselves instead of God. And so we're all on a trajectory toward life disintegration. But that trajectory won't stop at the end of our lives. When God returns, He will judge every action, every thought, every longing, everything your heart has ever produced. And if there is anything imperfect, then we will not be able to remain in His presence. And being out of the presence of God, who is all light and all truth, means utter darkness and eternal disintegration. The biblical prophets describe this final day of judgment. One example is Isaiah 13, 9-13. See the day of the Lord's coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and to destroy sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of His burning anger. This was our trajectory as well at Jesus' death. And His death was the only way that it could be altered. And this is why Jesus had to go to the cross. He fell into the complete darkness and isolation for which we were headed. He died the death that we should have died so that we could be saved from that judgment and instead be able to live in the light and the presence of God. How do we know that Jesus' death on the cross worked in changing the potential trajectory of our lives and delivering us from spiritual darkness and God's judgment? Well, back in Mark chapter 15, verse 35, when some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Remember that the curtain in the temple was not a flimsy little veil. It was thick and heavy, almost as substantial as a wall. And the curtain separated the Holy of Holies, where God's Shekinah glory dwelled, from the rest of the temple. And it separated the people from the presence of God. And remember that only the holiest men, the high priest, from the holiest nation, the Jews, could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year on a holy day, Yom Kippur, and he had to bring a blood sacrifice in atonement for sins. The curtain said loudly and clearly that it is impossible for anyone sinful, anyone in spiritual darkness, to come into God's presence. At the moment Jesus died, this massive curtain was ripped open. The tear was from top to bottom, just to make it clear who did it. And this was God's way of saying, this is the sacrifice of Jesus, this is a sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. The way is now open to approach me. Now that Jesus has died, anybody who believes in him, it can connect to God. Now that Jesus has died, the barrier is gone for good. Our trajectory has been permanently redirected towards God. And that's only possible because Jesus paid the price for our sin. Anybody who believes in him can go in now. And to make sure we get the point, Mark immediately shows us the first person who went in, the centurion. And his confession, surely this man was the Son of God, is momentous. Why? Because the first line in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark refers to Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Up to this point in Mark, no human being had figured it out who Jesus really was. The disciples had called him the Christ, though in the prevailing culture, the Christ, as I said, was not considered to be divine or to be God. All along, Jesus' teachings and acts of power, and even his testimony in front of the chief priests, had been pointing to the fact that he was God. And the people had been asking, who is this? But the first person to truly get it was the centurion who presided over his death. And this is even more unlikely because he's a Roman. Even Roman coins of the time inscribed Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, on them. The only person a loyal Roman would ever call the Son of God was Caesar. But this man gave that title to Jesus. And he was a hard character. The centurions were not aristocrats who got military commissions. They were enlisted men who had risen through the ranks. And so this man had seen death and had inflicted it to a degree that you and I can hardly imagine. Here is a hardened and brutal man, and yet something had penetrated his spiritual darkness, and he became the first person to confess the deity of Jesus Christ. There's a striking contrast between the centurion and everybody else around the cross. The disciples, who had been taught by Jesus repeatedly and at length that this day would come, were completely confused, and most of them were absent from the scene. The religious leaders had looked at the very deepest wisdom of God in the Old Testament scriptures and yet rejected it. What penetrated the centurion's darkness? How did he suddenly come into the light? It must have been because the centurion heard Jesus' cry and he saw how Jesus died. Now, I've only seen one person actually breathe their last breath, and I'll never forget that experience. Very likely you too have been present for a death only once or twice, if at all. But the centurion had seen many people die, and many of those by his own hand. And yet even for him, this death was unique. He saw something about Jesus' death that was unlike any other. The tenderness of Jesus, despite the terror, must have pierced right through his hardness. The beauty of Jesus in his death must have flooded his darkness with light. Christianity is the only religious faith that says that God himself actually suffered, actually cried out in suffering. Now, what good is that? Well, to Jesus' followers assembled around the cross, it certainly seemed senseless, that there was no good in it at all. But in fact, they came to realize that Jesus' suffering was of immense good to them, as can we. Why is that? Because they would eventually see that they had been looking right at the greatest act of God's love, power, and justice in history. God came into the world, and he suffered and died on the cross in order to save us. It is the ultimate proof of his love for us. When you suffer, you may be completely in the dark about the reason for your own suffering. It may seem as senseless to you as Jesus' suffering seemed to the disciples. But the cross tells you what the reason isn't. It can't be that God doesn't love you. It can't be that he has no plan for you. It can't be that he has abandoned you. Because Jesus was abandoned. He paid the price for our sins so that God the Father would never abandon you. The cross proves that he loves you, that he understands what it means to suffer. It also demonstrates that God can be working in your life even when it seems like there's no rhyme or reason to what's happening. Jesus Christ not only died the death that we should have died, he also lived the life that we should have lived but can't and fail to. His was a perfect obedience in our place. It doesn't matter who you are, centurion, prostitute, hitman, minister, the curtain has been ripped from top to bottom. The barrier is gone. There is forgiveness and grace for you. By saying the centurion heard his cry, Mark is pressing the story right up to your ear. And if you listen closely to that cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? You can see the same beauty, the same tenderness. If you see Jesus losing the infinite love of the Father out of his infinite love for you, it should melt your hardness. No matter who you are, it should open your eyes and shatter your darkness. No matter who you are, you will at long last be able to turn away from those other things that dominated your life, addicting you and drawing you away from God. Jesus Christ's darkness can dispel and destroy your own, so that in the place of hardness and darkness and death, you and I can have tenderness and light in life.